people can be fallible with respect to the reasons that apply to them, whether those reasons are prudential reasons or epistemic reasons or moral reasons. I think that there are such things, and that none of us, certainly myself included, are omniscient with respect to those reasons, and so we can make deep mistakes about what reasons apply to us. And that's possible only if there's some kind of objectivity to those norms that generate the reasons.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's AMA. Today we have Professor Russ Shafer-Landau, who is Professor of Philosophy at University of Wisconsin-Madison, previously taught at the University of Kansas, received his PhD from the University of Arizona, has primary philosophical interest in ethics, and has written extensively influentially on moral realism-related issues. Books include Moral Realism, A Defense, Whatever Happened to Good and Evil, Fundamentals of Ethics, and others. He's the editor for the Oxford Studies in Metaethics anthology series. If I missed anything you'd like to mention or forgot something wrong, you can feel free to make note. But with that, welcome, Professor Shafer-Landau.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
All right. So I have a few questions that we can get to at the beginning, but just to make note, if anyone wants to get on VC to ask a question to Professor Russ Shafer-Landau, you can just make note of that in chat. Just ping us. We can unmute you, or you can just post a question to be read in the AMA discussion channel. So I guess to start off, for those who are not super familiar with your work and views, maybe you could briefly describe your views on moral realism.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that morality is objective in a really robust way. So I think there are correct moral standards. We don't make them up. We discover them if we are morally sensitive. No one made them up. It's not that objectivity requires some authority figure like God to underwrite the laws. It's rather that they are there awaiting our discovery. We can know them. There is such a thing as moral knowledge. There are such things as moral truths. And I don't have elaborate views about what they are. I mean, I could, and your listeners would probably agree to a lot of what they are, unless your listeners are extreme skeptics. But my brief is largely not to try to offer a list of do's and don'ts, what's right and wrong, but rather to argue about the status as opposed to the content of morality. And the status is, in my view, that they are robustly objective.
Great. So you've argued that these things can be known, or at least some of them can be known a priori. Is that a position you still hold? Can you kind of comment on that briefly?
Sure, it is a position I still hold. It might help me since I'm new to this server. I don't really have a sense of how I should pitch my answers, whether your members or whether I can presuppose a decent amount of familiarity with philosophy, or whether I should not presuppose that. That would help me to answer your views.
I think there's a range.
That's a good question. Yeah, there is a pretty substantial range in sort of philosophical background. So I guess the best to assume some, but not too advanced, because there's going to be a fair amount of people listening that are not very familiar with the issues.
Okay, so I think that I still do think that there is the possibility and actuality, in fact, of a priori moral knowledge. That is, I think that when it comes especially to the fundamental moral principles, it's not that plausible a view to think that we acquire typically justification or knowledge from empirical sources. I said typically because I think it is possible to acquire moral knowledge by testimony and that's an a posteriori source of evidence. But that case aside, I think it's much more plausible to think that if we can have moral knowledge at all, we get it from the armchair. It's not that we get it innately. I just want to be clear about that. I have no views about whether infants are imbued with moral wisdom. Actually, sorry, I do. They're not imbued with moral wisdom. They don't have moral knowledge. They might have proto-moral sensibilities and things like that, but they don't have moral knowledge. So I think that you've got to have a modicum of experience, and you've got to get concept acquisition, which comes a posteriori. But once you've got the concepts in mind, and I think have a reasonable set of emotional capacities, then other things equal, you're in a position to sit down and think about some moral propositions and just see that they're, figuratively, see that they're true. Reflect on it, and then can come to appreciate that these are true. And so I do still believe that there is such a thing as a priori moral knowledge.
Great. But so would you stay in those cases where we come to some moral knowledge a posteriori, or I say via testimony and whatnot, those truths that we come to know still, in principle, we could have come to know them a priori? Is that something you would say?
That's a great question. In many cases, yes, and especially with regard to fundamental principles, it is the case. I just want to be clear that when it comes to your knowledge about the morality of specific actions or the morality of a person's motives or intentions in a given at a given time, there's part of that knowledge is empirical. I don't want to deny that. If you're just mistaken about the facts of what this person's intention was, or the facts about the nature of the non-moral nature of this action, you can very well be mistaken about the concomitant moral belief. So I want to allow that there are such things as what philosophers call defeaters of moral knowledge that can be where moral knowledge is acquired a priori. There can be a posteriori defeaters. And I also want to allow that when it comes to positively gaining moral knowledge, there are many cases where we do that a posteriori, because there are many cases where we're not focused on general moral principles themselves, but rather these sort of the moral verdicts to render in concrete cases where we just need to have concrete empirical a posteriori knowledge in order to get moral knowledge.
Assuming I understood you correct, it seems to follow that at least some of our a priori knowledge is therefore fallible. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't think that certainty is a precondition of knowledge in any area. And so you did follow me absolutely correctly. And so I think that knowledge is, they're probably, I don't want to say all, because whenever a philosopher says all, some other smart person finds a counterexample. So there are probably some counterexamples to this, but nothing that's coming to mind in the moral realm, where what I'm talking about are counterexamples to the claim that it's possible to know something and then later to acquire a posteriori knowledge that defeats that.
Right, but even in the case of the a priori
evidence.
Yeah. All right, so one more question related to this, and then I think Dog wanted to get on mic. As I recall, you defend a sort of reliabilism about how we come to moral knowledge. That's correct, right?
Yes, I did, but I no longer do that.
Oh, interesting.
But you're right. I mean, yeah, in my book from 18 years ago, there was a chapter there that did just that. Mm-hmm.
So what is your position on sort of moral epistemology now, roughly, and why did you change your mind on that?
Yeah, so I'm just not that I've come to be persuaded by various criticisms of reliabilism, and I have what philosophers call a more internalist bent now in epistemology, a more thoroughgoingly internalist bent, according to which, what counts, the conditions under which one's justified in believing are predicated on other things that are happening in your mind. Let's put it that way. And what reliabilism does is that it violates that internalist constraint. So that in a very short and sweet, or maybe short and ugly, that's the reason why I've moved away from the reliabilism.
And so, aside from a sort of a general commitment to or preference for an internalist picture, you don't have any more specific views about moral epistemology?
Oh, I do have a lot more specific views.
I figured.
Yeah. So I'll give a little ad for work in progress. Now, I'm working on 3 books with my UW colleague John Bankson and University of Vermont philosopher Terence Cuneo. And the 2 of these books are big books that offer new defenses of moral realism. The second, the first of these is at the publishers, being vetted now. The second is still in progress. The second is substantially about moral epistemology. We have 5 chapters on moral epistemology, and the emphasis of that epistemology is intuition, where intuitions are construed not as beliefs of any kind, but as intellectual seemings, if you will, being struck a certain way at the consideration of a proposition, in this case, a moral proposition. And that phenomenon of being struck is in many ways analogous to perceptual seemings, which are not themselves beliefs, but serve as a basis for justifying beliefs that are formed as a result of those perceptions. I think a very similar picture is plausible in the moral realm, where you contemplate a proposition and you're just struck by its truth. Now, the striking can be fallible, so maybe I should say struck by its apparent truth, but actually the content of the striking is, that's true. And of course, given that I'm a realist, and given that people are sometimes have incompatible moral intuitions, we can't just make an inference from the fact that I've intuited something like genocide's immoral to the fact that genocide actually is immoral. There's a step there, and it's not an entailment for sure. So it is fallible, but nevertheless, I think perception is fallible too. All of our sources, all of our evidential sources, are fallible. I could say yet more, but I'm leery since I can't actually see anybody here. I can't pick up on any facial cues. Like, okay, enough. Let's move on. So I'll try to keep it short. Yeah, you just
that's
do
great.
with it what you will. Yeah. Okay.
So that is a sort of like phenomenal conservatism, then, right? About
it is. It's certainly it's that kind of view of intuition has been allied with a phenomenal conservatism by Mike Humer, most prominently, for instance. But I'm not that much of a fan of saying that appearances are all innocent until proven guilty, and we can proceed forthwith. I think we need a more robust defense of the justificatory power of intuitions than an appeal to phenomenal conservatism, which, for those listeners who don't get what that is, it's just the idea. It's this kind of it's picking up on the phenomena, this phenomenological experience of being appeared to in a certain way. That's the phenomenological element. And the conservatism is just granting deference to those appearances by default until we've got some contrary evidence to undermine them. My view is not that dissimilar, or our view is not that dissimilar. I don't want to overemphasize differences, for sure. And that could be a handy place to put our view, if you like.
All right, and that book you mentioned, or the couple that you mentioned are in the works or at the publisher. One of them was called Understanding Morality, right? Or is intended to be called?
Well, that's an old title. When we started working on this project 7 years ago, we had in mind the development of one book, and then it became clear that we had written so much across that nobody would read a book that was 700 pages. So what we've done is we've written one book just on philosophical methodology. We've developed a philosophical method that takes elements of popular methods, like the method of argument, or the method of analysis, or the cost-benefit method, or reflective equilibrium, takes elements of these, some of these, but sort of regiments it, organizes these elements in a novel way. And that book, we're actually working through it for the final time before we send it off for copy edits, which I expect will be in about a month or two. And then and then the other two books are just in metaethics. One is called The Moral Universe, and that is a big book. It's about 350 pages, and that's just on the metaphysics and the normativity of morality. And then this last book that I was alluding to is called Grasping Morality, and that book is on moral epistemology and action theory, a little bit of philosophy of language. So
very interesting.
It's been keeping me busy for the last 7 years.
It sounds like it. All right, so Doug, if you want to unmute, you can ask a question. Can't hear you, but you're unmuted. Doug, we still can't hear you. Well, while we're waiting for Doug to get his mic fixed out, I guess we can. David Lee Roth had a question.
Yes, thank you so much for coming here, Dr. Landau. And I want to say I'm very sympathetic to your moral realism. But I had a question. What is a question, I guess, or a problem that you believe that moral realism solves that someone holding to moral anti-realism cannot also resolve? So, in essence, what do you think is the epistemic virtue of holding to moral realism rather than anti-realism? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very broad question. I have a lot of different possible ways of answering that, depending on the sort of anti-realism you had in mind. Given the fact that you've asked the question you did, you're obviously conversant with debates in metaethics, and I think the appropriate answer depends on which anti-realist view you'd like me to focus on, because different such views have different strengths and, in my view, different weaknesses.
Yeah, I would prefer if you focus on error theory. What's something that you believe moral realism offers that error theory does not? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I think moral realism offers everything that error theorists don't. So, and for those listeners who aren't sure what the moral error theory is, it's the view that although our moral judgments are beliefs, that in making sincere moral judgments, we try to speak the truth and accurately represent moral reality. That sounds very grand, but it's not necessarily such a grand enterprise. Nevertheless, we invariably fail to do that because there is no such thing. There is no moral reality. It's akin to the theists' take on the atheists' take on theism, namely that although theists are trying to speak the truth about divine properties and their relationship with God, they can't do it because there is no such thing as God. There is nothing divine about the world, and so invariably they fail to speak the truth. Either they're religious claims are uniformly false, or they're at least uniformly untrue. And the moral error theorist says the same thing about sincere moral talk as well. And this is going to come across as tendentious. This is what I'm about to say is not going to convince an error theorist for sure, but I hope it might be appealing to those who aren't already committed to error theory. And if you're an error theorist, you have to deny that there are any moral truths, and therefore you have to deny that it's true, for instance, that genocide's immoral. You have to deny that it's true that enslaving people for profit is immoral. I think that's a huge cost. I think that those claims are about as obviously true as anything. There are probably claims that I have a little higher credence in, but not much. And if you're an error theorist, you have to give up on that, and that strikes me as a very significant cost. Of course, as I say, if you're an error theorist, you'll have an answer to that. You'll have an answer to all of my objections, and I'm just going to leave it to others who, determine the comparative plausibility. That's the big liability I'd point to.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Oh, did you have a follow-up? All right. We had doesn't look like Dog has come back, so we'll wait on that. But we had a text question from Kathleen, who asked, do you take moral realism to be a pursuit of something categorical and possibly unassailable, or is it enough to say that morals are objective in the same sense that money is? That is, it is mind-dependent, however, it is not subject to a single individual's thoughts on the matter.
Okay, good. Thanks, Catherine. I take that to be at least two questions. One is about the nature of this kind of individual mind independence, and the other is about its categorical / unassailable status. I'll take them in reverse order. So one thing that's distinctive about moral realism's picture about the objectivity of morality is that it is very strongly mind, or as I prefer to put it, stance independent. Its view about the status of morality is that morality is very strongly stance independent, such that for the moral claims that are true, they're not true in virtue of any individuals or even any groups say so. The attitudes of any group, like even as large as a whole society, is not determinative of, it's not the truth maker, it's not the ground of, it's not that in virtue of which those moral claims are true. And so the morality of a given action, like let's just take, if any example is going to be uncontroversial, let's just stick with this genocide example, that genocide's immoral. And so that claim is true not because of any kind of tacit or explicit social convention, even were that convention to be shared universally among human beings. That might be a decent indicator, it might be, of the truth of that claim, but that's not what makes the claim true. So that's the answer to the money business. With regard to the unassailability or categoricity point, many people, there are a lot of different, like as with any philosophical ism, there are a lot of different takes on what the ism really is. My view is that you really want to get categorical nature of moral requirements into the picture. And if you don't, then there are people who call themselves moral realists and defend a quite robust kind of objectivity. But if they don't also defend the authority of morality, then to me it's not fully satisfactory. I don't deny them a claim to call themselves realists. It doesn't really matter what label we place on things. What matters is that we appreciate what position different people or different folks are taking with regard to the really deep issues. One really deep issue is the objectivity issue. And if morality is objective, in what precise sense is it objective? But there's another really deep issue. There are a lot of them, but another one is what authority, what kind of rational, or sometimes people like to use this fancy word, normative authority, does morality have over us? Because after all, if morality might be so robustly objective in this stance/mind independent way that I favor, and yet it might be that people have no reason at all to comply with its dictates, that would be very disappointing to me. You still, I mean, there are lots of brilliant philosophers who've called themselves realists, who've defended a view like that, according to which morality really doesn't have any rational authority because, for instance, what you have reason to do or what's rational for you to do depends entirely on what you care about. But morality doesn't depend on what you care about, and so there can be a fundamental disconnect between morality's demands and the demands of reason. I don't like that disconnect, and I want to argue on behalf of the claim that when we are morally required to do something, there is also excellent reason, very strong and categorical reason to comply with that demand. So probably I've said at least enough, maybe too much about that.
No, that's good. And Kathleen sort of had a follow-up question on that, where she asked, is it not more likely that most morals, or perhaps moral beliefs, are going to be codified, cohesive actions based on trial and error in pursuit of more complex societies, as well as evolutionary mechanisms?
I don't deny that our moral beliefs have been influenced to some extent by evolutionary factors. I've written about this at a few places, and I think it would be foolish to say there's no influence whatever. I think the devil's in the details, and a lot will depend on exactly what sorts of influences we see. I also think it would be foolish to deny that any person's moral beliefs have been influenced to some extent by their parents or guardians as they were raised, the society in which they live, the things they read, the things they watch on the internet, and things like that. So I do allow that there are a variety of influences on our moral beliefs, but I also think that we're able to sort of sift and winnow among those, and to be able to, in good circumstances, to identify some of these influences as pernicious ones and others as legitimate ones. And so better form our moral beliefs in light of that sort of reflection.
Do you think that sort of response is going to work in response to like evolutionary debunking arguments and arguments like from Sharon Street about the influence of evolutionary pressures on our moral beliefs?
I certainly hope so. That for those listeners who don't know who Sharon Street is, she's this terrific philosopher at NYU, and she really started a literature within philosophy 15 years ago, and it's become a huge literature now, where what she did in the scope of a 55-page article was to present this debunking, so-called evolutionary debunking argument against moral realism, which basically said this, that the best explanation of why we hold the moral views we do is because evolution has programmed us to effectively, she doesn't use that word, I don't think, programmed us to have certain sentiments. And these sentiments we just sort of ennoble into our moral views. And she believes that sort of historical account is correct, but then she says, well, if you're a moral realist and you think that our attitudes don't play any role in fixing the truth, the moral truth, then you've got to try to explain how it is that our attitudes, shaped as they were, could latch onto this strongly objective reality, and there's no way that a realist can do that. And my to simplify greatly, my view is that it's really speculation to think that all of our moral views are the product of evolutionary influences. In fact, there's really excellent reason to think that they're not all that way. And if they're not all that way, then then the challenge is basically like a more familiar challenge, which is to say, why think that your moral views get it right when so many of them have been shaped by the culture you've been raised in? Had you been raised in a different culture, you would have had different moral views. So why think that the moral views you contingently hold are anything other than parochial ones? How can they latch onto this objective reality? And that's a great question. But I think that science can't tell us that all of our moral views are the product of effectively distorting influences. I just don't think science is in a position, and actually will ever be in a position, to do that. And so I think that it's incumbent on someone like me to be able to offer a positive moral epistemology that explains how we can latch on to these objective truths. But I don't think that these kinds of debunking arguments are in the end going to be successful across the board. Just one last caveat. I know I'm talking a lot about this point, but I do think that some of our moral views are ripe for debunking. Some of our moral views are nothing other than the product of inheritance from outdated social mores. Some of our moral views reflect various kinds of prejudices, say, various kinds of sexist or racist assumptions that have been pervasive in our culture. And to the extent that our moral views have that ideology, that is that set of historical antecedents, then they are deserving of debunking. So I don't object to the thought that our moral views should be scrutinized for their origins, but what I doubt very much is that some of our moral views, like the view that that genocide is immoral, are wholly the product of some genetic programming, say, or some religious program, the vestige of religious programming, or something like that.
All right. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more you can say about that, but we'll move on to Doug. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Well, can you hear my mic?
Yep, we're gonna hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Yes, hello, Dr. Shafer-Landau. My question is, what do you think of a person? So, like, if somebody rejected, let's say they bit the bullet and rejected that there are any moral or any kind of norms at all, meaning like institutional norms, hypothetical norms, epistemic norms. Like, what do you think they would be missing out on? Like, why is that an issue?
Yeah. Well, I think, I guess I would think that it'd be very, very hard to deny that there are hypothetical norms. That is, norms take the following form. Namely, if you want this, do that. That's what a hypothetical norm is. It's conditional or hypothetical on your wanting something or having a certain end. And I don't know anybody who denies those, but if you were to deny those, then you'd have no way of giving anyone advice, or no way of, including yourself, no way of giving yourself any advice at all. And that would be a big problem, I think.
Well, but I'm not sure, I'm not sure you couldn't give anybody advice. Like, you could still, like, talk, use hypothetical norm talk to basically try to compel someone to act in a certain way, right? Like, if you thought that they wanted to make a good living, you might tell them to invest. But the point is that I don't think you need to be committed to real, like, hypothetical norms or normativity at all in order to make that advice. Like, you would just say that, look, your advice isn't, it's not getting at something true, right? It's not like there's some thing called like a hypothetical norm that compels that person to invest, right? Like, the point is that you're just telling him that investing would help him achieve his goal, right?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I should be clear. I don't think that norms are going to compel anybody to do anything. Like the norms are those sorts of things that, by definition, can be broken. And so, even if it's true, say, even if my view about morality is true, that's not going to compel someone who's a complete narcissist or complete egoist to comply with moral norms. So I don't want to hold out as a success condition for the existence of norms that they be able to compel compliance. With regard to hypothetical norms, what I think is that, to me, you asked my thought about what would be missing. I think you're right that just in conversation you can offer someone advice, but I also, based on their aims, but I also think it makes sense to say that if they fail to take it, like this, if your advice actually is accurate advice about how most efficiently to get what they want, and if they fail to take it and act in, say, just the contrary way, I think it also further makes sense to say that they're acting against reason or they're acting irrationally. And that's what having that's what the norms being true enables you to add. Now you might say, well, appeals to rationality and reason might not do any convincing of this person. They might not be pragmatically effective at all. And I want to be the first to allow that. But the question is not what's going to be most. I'm at least interpreting your question as not as what's going to be the most effective way to get somebody to do what you think they should do, but rather, is there anything correct in noting that if you flout a norm, then you are also subject to correct normative evaluation, so that we can say of such a person that he or she's irrational. With respect to epistemic norms, if they violate those, then we can correctly say that although they hold that belief and might be unbudgeable, nevertheless, their belief is unjustified, that they've got a genuine epistemic reason grounded in standards that aim at truth. They've got an epistemic reason that they're flouting when they believe something that's contrary to all the evidence that's available to them. And ditto for moral norms. I want to be able to, it's just, if somebody doesn't believe in the moral norm and you affirm it, then it can amount in the end just a table pounding to reaffirm it. If someone's dead set on committing murder, and say, basing that on the fact that I don't like the way they look, and therefore I'm going to kill them, and I say that's immoral, and they say either I don't care or I reject the existence of moral standards. Probably nothing I can say is going to convince them, much less compel them, but I still think it's an attraction of a theory that allows us to say that of such a person, that they really are acting immorally. And if my liking of categorical norms is correct, that they're acting contrary to reasons that apply to them, even if they can't see those reasons. I want to allow, in other words, that people can be fallible with respect to the reasons that apply to them, whether those reasons are prudential reasons or epistemic reasons or moral reasons. I think that there are such things, and that none of us, certainly myself included, are omniscient with respect to those reasons. And so we can make deep, deep mistakes about what reasons apply to us. And that's possible only if there's some kind of objectivity to those norms that generate the reasons.
Okay, thank you for that. My other question actually is a follow-up on something you said previously, that you think that norms, that in order for something to be a norm, you have to be able to be out of accord with it. But then the question is, like, what if there are certain things, let's say epistemic norms, that say that you shouldn't be like a solipsist, for example. But it might be the case that people just aren't capable of truly being solipsists. Like, they could say that they're solipsists, but they won't genuinely believe it, or at the very least, they will like reject it eventually, right? So the idea is that it seems like we have reasons to believe that in fact there are certain things that are norms, even though you can't be out of accord with them just due to some like inability, psychological or physical.
That's interesting. Yeah, maybe you're right about that.
Like, for
I don't
example,
have, yeah.
I could say that it would be wrong for someone to like blow up the planet, right? Or it'd be wrong for someone to snap everyone out of existence like Thanos, right? But the idea is that, well, nobody could do that even if they did want to, right? So like it still seems wrong to most people for someone to do that. But the point is that just because it's wrong doesn't mean that people can be in accord or out of accord with that. Right.
Yeah, I get you might be right, but I haven't yet heard an example that convinces me that you're right, or even makes me think that you're right. So, for instance, I mean, a lot depends on the kind of the construal of. I'm going to use this fancy word, the modal force of the could in the claim uh, for any given norm, and there's at least one agent who could flout it. What I mean by modal force is, how do you understand that could? Is it logical possibility? Is it metaphysical
Okay, I see.
possibility? Things like
Yeah.
that. So, you're right with regard to, say, the moral norm that says, don't blink don't snap your fingers and destroy the whole world.
Yeah.
You're right. Physically, it's not physically possible for anybody to do that. I think, though, it's compatible. I think, but I'm no physicist. It's compatible with the laws of physics. So contingently, right now, no one could actually do that. But that's not the kind of could I had in mind. I was thinking about logical possibility, and maybe even
Okay.
metaphysical possibility. So yeah, probably logical for sure, and maybe metaphysical possibility too.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I had a bit of a follow-up on that first response about how people can be deeply mistaken about the motivations or reasons that apply to them. If we consider the case of the ruthless immoralist, which is an example that you've used, who has never had any motivation or disposition to follow the objective moral principles, in virtue of what would we say that he is deeply mistaken? Like, maybe this is just to repeat like a internalist intuition, but I mean, if there's nothing in his psychology that would push him in that direction to follow those rules, why say that that's a reason that he's mistaken about at all?
Well, what's the reason in particular? So the reason that he's mistaken is because he's failing to see sorry, let me put it more straightforwardly. The explanation for why he's mistaken is that he's failing to see or appreciate the existence of a reason that applies to him. And I take it your question is, well, I think there is such a reason. And here's my answer. Because I think he's blameworthy for his actions. The ruthless immoralist is blameworthy for his actions. He's got no excuse, as far as I can tell. I mean, we can conjure up a scenario. I don't know if there actually is anyone like this, but let's just conjure up a scenario where by doing the moral thing, by like not assassinating someone, he's not going to get anything he wants. Let's just assume that. Okay. Then there are two ways to go. One way is to say, well, all the reasons for action that you have depend on what you care about. So if you don't care about anything you'd get by acting morally, you don't have any reason to act morally. That's one view. That's not mine, but it's a view that many people hold. And then there's my view, which says that just because you aren't in your action going to get something you care about, that's compatible with there still being a reason for you. The reason obviously doesn't come from your wants. Those are so-called hypothetical reasons. And I certainly allow that there are hypothetical reasons, but I think there's something in addition to them, these categorical reasons that apply to you regardless, but are not grounded in, they're not based in satisfying your desires or getting you what you care about. So why think that there are why think that there are reasons like that? Well, let's take this ruthless immoralist that you mentioned, and just imagine he's not going to get anything for himself that he cares about out of towing the moral line. Well, I want to say that if he goes ahead and assassinates somebody, he's doing something that's not only wrong but blameworthy. He doesn't have an excuse. It's not that someone, say, put a gun to his head and forced him to do that. It's not that anyone hypnotized him and manipulated him into doing that. He made the free choice to do that. Let's just build that into the scenario. So if we assume that he's blameworthy, I think it's a conceptual truth. You don't have to go that far. You just have to get where I want you to go. You just have to think it's a truth that if you're blameworthy for something, then there's a reason not to have done it. And I think that's extremely plausible. Suppose that weren't true. If it weren't true, then you could be blameworthy for something, even though there's no consideration at all that opposed your action. I just don't understand how that can be. There's got to be, if you're blameworthy, that's a kind of criticizability. You're liable to criticism there, and in order for our practices of criticism to be even minimally fair, there's got to be some plausible basis for leveling the criticism, and that, to me, would take the form of some consideration that opposes the action you're being blamed / criticized for. But that's just what a reason is. It's consideration that favors or opposes. And so if you're willing to grant that this ruthless moralist is blameworthy in the first place because he's done something wrong, he's acted fully in character, and he doesn't have an excuse, then that seems to me to entail that there's some reason opposing his action. But the reason, by hypothesis, given the way we sketch his psychological profile, the reason can't be rooted in securing any of his aims, because we've built into the scenario that he's not going to get anything he cares about by staying his hand and doing the morally right thing. So that's my argument for thinking that there's some reason here, and it's a reason that doesn't hinge on, it's not hypothetical. It doesn't hinge on his getting him what he wants. And then the question is, well, if there is that reason, where does it come from? And I think the most natural answer here is it comes from the moral requirement that he's flouted.
Interesting. What do you think of sort of an anti-realist response, just to sort of Murray shift that argument, instead say, well, because there is in fact no reason, then he isn't really blameworthy, or something like that?
What I'd say is believe it if you can. I mean, so yeah, you could accept that blameworthiness entails reasons, and you could be, this is tendentious, of course, so in the grip of a theory that you're convinced that he can't have a reason here, given the sketch of his psychological profile, and therefore he can't be blameworthy. Okay, all I'd say is that if he can't be blameworthy, then given that he's done wrong, as I think we should admit, unless you're an error theorist, given that he's done wrong, then you've got to point to some excuse, and I'm not sure what that excuse would be.
All right, and I'll move on to another text question. We had one from Joy Wolf about resolving disagreement. She said, if two people can have conflicting moral intuitions in a given circumstance, Do you have a view about the method of convincing or evaluating one moral view over the other?
No. I mean, let's put it this way. It would be awesome if I did, if I was able to, if I had an algorithm. Yeah, but that's probably not plausible. But even the method for, probably securing agreement between people who have, say, really entrenched intuitional disagreements. But I don't, unfortunately. I actually don't think that there is one. I can say things at a certain level of generality that strike me as true, but I don't know how effective they're going to be in real life situations of the sort that this question asked about. So, what do we do when we confront someone who disagrees with us and we're sort of struck because, wow, that's surprising. It strikes me so clearly that this action is right or wrong. And now I come up against somebody who has just the opposite approach. Wow, that's really surprising. In most cases, that'll be really surprising. So what to do? Well, you can make sure that, so here are the things that I think are true, but probably are not that helpful. I don't know that anything more detailed is going to be both true and helpful. Maybe though, but I'm just not sure. So you need to go ahead and make sure that you're both really on the same page with regard to the scenario that you're contemplating. Are you using the terms in the same way? Like some people, familiar sort of disagreement. Some people say, disagreeing about whether God exists, for instance. The first thing you need to do in that sort of situation is make sure you're both talking about the same thing. Someone might be talking about the omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent creator of the universe, and the other person might be talking about energy. And if someone says God doesn't exist, they presumably don't mean that energy doesn't exist. So the first thing to do is you got to make sure that you're not talking past one another, that you're actually using terms to mean the same thing, that you've got and that whatever scenario is dividing you, that you really agree to how that scenario is being sketched. That sounds facile, but in fact, in many real life disagreements, it's conflicts at that step that are responsible for the disagreements we see. And if we just got clear about the terms of the debate, we could actually resolve a whole bunch of disagreement. Not all disagreement, for sure. So what about the disagreement that remains? Well, at that point, what you do is you try to enlist analogous cases, or you try to enlist, you offer arguments of the sort I just did. For instance, on behalf of the claim that even the immoralist who's not going to get anything from doing the right thing, nevertheless has a reason to do the right thing. So you proceed to offer arguments. Now, is it the case that many of those arguments will rely, maybe all those arguments will rely on at least one premise that your interlocutor will disagree with? The answer may well be yes at some point. And so what I want to allow is that it's possible for there to be intractable moral disagreement in this world. I not everybody endorses that, but I think it's just it's a sad but true fact that given people's psychological profiles, given their propensities, given their existing commitments, that there's even if both parties to such a disagreement were to work perfectly methodically through and logically through their existing commitments, they might end up with a set of commitments that still agreed with someone else's, at least in part, with someone else's set of commitments. And that, to me, that's not pessimism. That's sort of a clear-eyed view about things. But I could be mistaken. And if I'm mistaken, that's awesome. Then we got an answer to this question. We've got an answer in principle to this question, namely that there will be some method as yet to be articulated that can take any two parties, no matter how intransigently they disagree right now, and get them to agree at the end of the day if they've got enough patience and enough smarts. That would be awesome if there were such a thing. Maybe I'm wrong in thinking that there isn't.
All right, thanks. I think Joy Wolf had a follow-up.
Yeah, so I have to be quick because I have to go to class, so I'll probably listen to the answer another time. But my question is, if the reason that your moral realist view has more virtue than, say, an error theorist view, is because an error theorist can't have the ability to say somebody's wrong about like any, I guess, moral position, then, and you don't have any way of saying, even assuming the moral realism, saying that their position, their moral position is incorrect, then what is the virtue of one over the other? I don't understand that.
Oh, well, I do with it. If you grant moral realism, I do have the means of saying that certain positions are moral positions are correct and others are incorrect. Now, what I meant to suggest earlier is that I can say that till I'm blue in the face, but that's not likely to convince an error theorist. But then what I'd say is this: let's take an actual look at the arguments for error theory and see whether or not they stand up. What the error theory does is it says, look, there's this widespread assumption to the effect that some things are right and some morally right and some things are morally wrong. That some moral judgments are true, some can be known. These views are all mistaken. Okay. Now, if you're going to say a whole swath of views are all mistaken, it's incumbent on you to give a pretty powerful argument for thinking that. If you take a look at the arguments that error theorists give, I don't find them surprise. I don't find them convincing. I think but error theorists do, and probably so many of them are super smart. They're not going to be they're going to go to their grave thinking moral realism is a fool's errand, and I'm going to go to my grave probably I don't know, thinking that error theory is just deeply mistaken. So this is just one example of what I didn't call pessimism earlier, and thinking there's going to be intractable disagreement here, not about a given moral claim, but about a philosophical issue about the status of morality. But anyway, this is just a promissory note. I'm not actually going to pause to analyze the various error theoretic arguments, but one of them, by far the most popular and prominent of them, basically says this: if there were such a thing as morality, it would have to be both objective and issue in categorical reasons of compliance. But morality cannot be objective, and there are no such things as categorical reasons, and therefore there is no such thing as morality after all. I'll grant the thought that if there is any such thing as morality, it's got to be along the lines that a realist depicts. Many philosophers are going to disagree with that, of course. If you're any person doing metaethics who's not a moral realist, but who's also not an error theorist, and there are many people in between those poles, then you're going to deny the claim that there's a genuine morality out there only if it's as the realist depicts it. So that's the first assumption that an error theorist makes, and it's one that most philosophers are going to not hop on board with. Okay, but let's assume that's correct. Then still, the error theorist, in order to make their case, needs to be able to vindicate their arguments against the objectivity of ethics and vindicate their arguments against the categoricity of moral requirements. And I've just given an argument that convinces me, at least, that there are such things as categorical moral reasons and requirements. It's not the final word, that's for sure. But that it works for me, And I think independently that there are various problems with the arguments against the objectivity and categoricity of morality that are offered by error theorists. So if I'm right, and I haven't given you very much to believe I'm right in this conversation so far, but if I am right, then those arguments by the error theorist aren't as powerful as error theorists themselves take them to be, in which case we aren't rationally compelled, and we in fact lack justification for thinking that morality is bunk or a fiction, as error theorists believe it to be.
All right. We had another voice question from from Shinichi. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Thanks for doing this AMA. I had a question that's sort of related to a supervenience argument against realism, namely Blackburn's, which I won't. I mean, if you don't need to explain it because I'm familiar with it. Maybe if other people aren't, you feel free to. But my question is sort of related to the sort of second part of that argument that talks about this entailment thesis. And first, what your thoughts are on it, because it seems like, and I could be wrong, but it seems like you think one option the realist can take is to just reject the no entailment thesis. And the second part of my question is to ask you, related to this, the sort of modality of moral truths. So if we take the supervenience claim seriously and we imagine, say, a world that's empty in so much as there's no concrete objects in it, are there going to be any moral truths? Because it seems to me that we might say, given there's no base for there to be any supervenience relation on, there's not going to be any moral truths aside from maybe some sort of conditional ones. And how that ties in kind of with this intuition that there are certain moral truths that are necessary, so that it doesn't matter if the world is empty. Certain moral truths are just going to be necessary regardless.
Yeah, great question. So picking up on the latter part of your question, I do think that a great many moral truths, including the fundamental moral principles, are metaphysically necessary. I also think that there are a number of truths, substantive moral truths, that are conceptually necessary. But it's not clear to me that the fundamental moral truths are conceptual truths. That claim that there are a number of substantive moral truths, like, for instance, recreational slaughter is immoral, or just to soften it, there's something pro tanto, presumptively wrong, immoral with recreational slaughter. I think that's a conceptual truth, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not an analytic truth, but I do think it's a conceptual truth. But let's assume I'm wrong about that, and let's just stick with metaphysical necessity. I do think that the fundamental moral principles are metaphysically necessary, and they take a conditional form, as you indicated. So if we had a world like the moon, where there's nothing, there are no moral agents there aren't going to be any concrete moral facts, but there's still the principle is still going to be true, that world, such that if any moral agents were to come to inhabit that world, then we'd likely start seeing some concrete moral facts. But in the absence of any such agents, all we can say is that the principles being metaphysically necessary hold in that world as well. As far as the entailment claim goes, because I believe that in a strong supervenience claim where the relevant modalities are metaphysical necessity, I think that there are going to be a whole bunch of entailments from a non-moral state of affairs to a moral state of affairs. And those entailments are going to be, among others, those that are expressed in fundamental moral principles. So, for instance, I know this is a very high level of abstraction. I assume you get it, but on the assumption that some of our listeners aren't getting what I'm saying, here's the basic idea that if you imagine a fundamental moral principle, let's just say, as a candidate example, the principle of utility. If an act maximizes overall happiness, then that action is morally right. If and only if an action maximizes happiness, then the action is morally right. In that kind of case, what I imagine, if suppose that were true, then what we do is we'd have an entailment that is metaphysically necessary between two act types. One act type is that of maximizing overall happiness, which is a non-moral property. And the other is the other act type is that of being morally required, which is a moral property. And in that case, if the principle of utility is true, and if it's a metaphysically necessary truth, then we've got an entailment claim. The entailment won't be, I don't think it's plausible to say that the entailment is going to be a conceptual truth. It won't be conceptually necessary that if an act maximizes happiness, then it's morally right. But that's okay. What's conceptually necessary, I think, is the general thesis of supervenience, which says for any two situations that are non-morally identical, any two situations that are non-morally identical will be morally identical. And that itself, that statement, is, I think, conceptually true. But the specific connection, that is the connection between specific non-moral properties or states of affairs and specific moral properties or states of affairs, these, in many cases, will be metaphysically necessary. And in some cases, they'll be conceptually necessary, but not all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. That was very helpful.
I had a sort of a quick follow-up on the your view on supervenience here. I think in Moral Realism Defense, you present a view about supervenience where you say that moral features are fully constituted by, but not identical to, the natural features on which they supervene. That's something you said, something like that, I believe. In there, but could you explain how we could have some sort of full constitution without identity? Like, for example, if I think that my desk is fully constituted by, a collection of atoms arranged a certain way, I might. It seems to me that I would just be saying that that's what my table is. It's not just a full constitution, but something about identity. So maybe could you comment on that briefly?
Yeah, sure. Two things. One is that I'm not confident in the Constitution story anymore, but if we just bracket that lack of confidence for right now, I can just tell you more generally how it is that Constitution doesn't imply identity. So let's take sort of standard example from metaphysics class where you've got the statue that's constituted by a whole bunch of gold atoms, gold molecules. And so you've got a statue, you've got the millions of molecules of gold that's constituting it, but they're not identical because you could retain this set of gold molecules. Let's say that there are 5 million gold molecules, and they can remain what they are even if you melt the statue down. In that case, what you've got are the gold molecules, but you no longer have the statue. And given that that's so, given that the gold molecules can realize a statue at one point and realize an ingot, a gold ingot at another, it follows that the statue is not identical to the molecules, because if it were identical to the molecules, then the ingot would have to be identical to the molecules, but the statue is not identical to the ingot. And given the transitivity of identity, you got a problem. So that's how you can have something that constitutes another thing without being identical to it.
Okay, so constitution won't include features like arrangement or structure or form, right? Necessarily.
No, I mean the whole constitution relation may well do that, but I'm talking about the what's the relationship between the constituent of something and the thing itself. In the book, I was talking about the constituent of a given action and the action. Here, in this example, I was talking about the constituents of the statue and the statue itself. The constituents are, that's the way I took your question. The constituents are not themselves identical to the statue. For the reasons I gave.
That's helpful. But you mentioned also that you're less committed to this sort of thesis. Can you maybe comment?
That's right. Yeah, I am. Yeah, but I guess I don't feel like I've got the time to go into my positive my metaphysical view right now. I've got to start cooking dinner in 5 minutes. Just
all right. We'll just get a couple more questions, and we'll wrap it up. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, let me ask a question.
Yeah, Doc had a question.
All right. Yeah. So I had 2 questions. My first question is this. I believe last time you did the AMA, you said that you were a deontologist. So presumably, like, deontologists would want to say something like, okay, so like you should not kill people. However, there might be exceptions to that, right? Like, so you should not kill people unless there is this or that situation. So my question is, since they grant that, couldn't you just say that, like, for utilitarianism, a utilitarian can just say you should do X, let's say, unless it like doesn't benefit, or it doesn't bring about like pleasure, right? Or if you're a relativist, couldn't you say that you should follow the cultural conventions or the cultural norms of your society, right? So the point is that, do you think that there's going to be a substantive ontological disagreement between deontologists, utilitarians, or is it just going to be like about the content of their norms? My other question is,
hang on, can I answer that first, because I'm not good at keeping lots of questions in my head at the same time. So as far as the intramural debates among different normative ethical positions, I don't think that there needs to be any ontological difference at all.
okay.
So they can all be realists, but they could also all be non-cognitivists or expressivists. So whatever the correct meta-ethical view about the status of moral claims is, presumably it's going to apply not just to deontologists, but across the board to consequentialists and deontologists and virtue theorists.
Oh, okay. The other question I had is, since norms, so categorical norms, are intentional, right? They have an aboutness to them, and yet they're non-physical. Do you think that this shows that perhaps our minds aren't physical, or do you think that intentionality can have physical instantiations?
I think intentionality definitely can have physical instantiations, and I don't see. I'm sorry, I'm not really seeing the connection between, on the one hand, affirming the existence of categorical reasons and the thought that the mind might be immaterial. I'm just not picking up on that connection.
Okay, thank you.
And if you have time, I think we have one more question from David Lee Roth.
Oh yes, thank you so much. Dr. Landau, I wanted to really quickly summarize the question. It seems like a lot of moral philosophers simply go on and say, you know what, it's unintuitive, for example, for, let's say, a error theorist to bite the bullet and say, let's say, it's not necessarily wrong to commit genocide. But let us say that an error theorist is willing to do that, like is willing to bite the bullet and say, you know what, it's maybe there isn't an objective problem with owning people as property. Other than simply saying that's intuitively wrong? Is there a philosophical problem to why you would object to this? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I guess the philosophical problem is that, again, twofold. I don't know that I'm saying anything new, though, at this point. One is that the arguments for that very, very striking conclusion you've assigned to some error theorists, the arguments don't seem to me to be compelling. And the other is that it does seem to me to, I guess, every view, probably every view has to bite bullets somewhere. And then, so I don't know. I guess I think that the view that I'm developing with John Banks and Terence Cuneo, we can really, of course I'd say this, but anyway, that's what I believe. We really can answer the objections to moral realism and offer many compelling positive arguments on its behalf. And one implication of the arguments we offer is that we remain entitled. In fact, if our arguments are correct, everybody remains entitled to say, and can say correctly, that owning other people is genuinely immoral. And that seems to me to be a benefit to a theory. If you have a theory that ends up saying, you know what, there is nothing wrong with slavery, that theory could be right, but it seems to be a cost of that theory. Now, there are, of course, error theorists are going to try to find ways of saying either that while it is a cost, it's a cost we can easily bear because our theory has so many compensating benefits. Or they can try to say, you know what, in the end, it's no cost at all. But it's not clear to me that any of their arguments for that latter, on behalf of that latter strategy, work. And so I'm left thinking it actually is a substantial cost of the theory. And in my survey of error theoretic arguments, I don't see enough in the way of compensating benefits of the theory to have it warrant our allegiance. But as I say, that's coming from someone who's committed himself to developing moral realism over the last 20 years. So you take my comments, for what they're worth.
All right, I think we're gonna probably wrap it up there. Since you have to go, I think. Thanks everyone for listening and asking questions, and thank you so much, Professor Shafer-Landau, for taking time to answer those questions.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.